Welcome to the Open Book with Amy and Tommy. We are glad to be back together again this week, but we have a tricky passage to look at
We do.
this week. Um, some of you may know our ministry associate for youth, Laura Addis, is writing our youth Bible study curriculum. Our youth have been using lectionary based curriculum for several years now, which is going really well. But one of the problems with lectionary based curriculum is that sometimes the author of that lesson uses the same text that Mac or whoever's preaching that day has chosen to preach on, but sometimes they don't. And there is something really wonderful about reading and studying the text you're going to be a part of worship. And so Laura has started writing curriculum for our youth. And we were talking about this passage last week, and she said, "Wait, is that in the Bible?" And she said, "I
That's
don't know what to do with that. So just sit and talk about what questions this brings up for you."
right.
So with that context, Tommy, will you read our passage
Yes.
for us?
Yes. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to them, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks
Thanks
be to
be to
God.
God. So so let me tell you, yesterday when I was preparing to record this today, I read this passage and I just really had trouble making sense of it.
Yes.
And then I opened some commentaries, and that didn't really help a lot either. But then I did what I often do when I struggle with the passage is I choose a different translation of the Bible to read it in. And particularly two of my go-tos when I'm struggling with what is happening here are the Message, which is kind of a contemporary paraphrase. um and so sometimes it can be a little bit more conversational slang, and you get a feel. And then one is a translation um that I use some with children, which is the New International Readers Version, and it's just written um it's written at a easier to understand reading level. And so sometimes as I read it, um I catch something, or it says something so plainly that I really really understand. And so, for me, as I was reading it, um the missing link was kind of why this, sorry, I'm just jumping right in here, but why um the manager went and was reducing the prices of everything. Was he trying to get money for what was he trying to do? And the missing link was that, we see his struggle in verse 3 about and 4, I can't dig, I'm not strong enough, I'm too ashamed to beg. And then in the New International Reader's Version, which I've got open here, it says, I know what I'm going to do. I'll do something so when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. And it says very similar in the NRSV. And really that verse helped click. Okay, this is about self-preservation. He's
Mm,
not a shrewd businessman. He is shrewd in making sure that he is taken care of. Um, so so I think some of my knowing that this passage is the shrewd manager trying to kind of sink into to what that is about. What questions
mm.
or what did you wrestle with as you were first reading this?
This is a great text, and I think one thing, um, I think it's important for us as ministers who went to seminary to say commentators disagree on this text all the time. That it's okay to say, I really don't know what this means. And I think that gives some freedom to open up this text and say, all right, here's some things it could mean.
Right.
And I think as people diverge into different paths on this, I think it's, you mentioned it's helpful to ask questions. Why is the dishonest manager or the shrewd manager or the unjust manager or whatever translation you say, what why are they commended by the by the rich guy, the wealthy guy? What does it mean? And who are the children of light? That gets thrown in at the end, and we'll look at that just in a minute. But I'm equally interested in this from our perspective. I think there are a couple of things that we need to talk about. I grew up in church, and one of the things that people hate to talk about is money.
Mhm.
And it feels like Jesus is always thinking about alternative economics.
Mhm.
What are the ways that we think about how we use our resources? I think um, it's part of what this text is speaking to. So we kind of, I don't know who all's thinking about the struggle here, and I'm going to maybe talk about that in a minute. I just want to point out at the beginning that this is a text we tend to avoid because it's about money.
Yes.
And, you know, money
Well,
is pretty complex. We
mhm.
we live in a society. This is not as a simple soundbite theology to say, well, do this, and that's what Jesus says. It's this kind of allows us to think about it being very complex. So I want to talk about wealth a little bit later, but that's kind of my
Yeah.
initial thinking
Well,
on this.
and I wanna say, I think it's for me, it's also hard. I think you're right. Money is tricky, and then
Mhm,
particularly when we pay attention to Jesus's teaching about money, because
mhm,
it is very and it really has to do with not holding on to it, and giving it away and sharing it, and so there's that. But here's another struggle with this for me. When I think about parables, I think about the ones we read last week. The shepherd who lost the sheep and the woman who lost the coin. And so we assign characters. And so God is the shepherd, I am the sheep. God is the woman, I am the coin. Or others, or I'm one of the 9 coins that is here and there's another coin out here. And so it's really easy to see and understand what Jesus is saying. Where do I find myself in this text? Who am I? Where is God? Who and because we're just used to it in or so many parables, it's kind of there's it's a little bit easier to kind of find ourselves and find God. This one is kind of like, well, who's in this? What's the point of this? And it's about something we hate to talk about or struggle to talk about. So that just add for me, that adds another layer of complication in
Yeah.
this parable.
So I think our tendency is to always, when we read our tendency, and it's a wrong tendency, is to always say, okay, the rich man, that's God. Now we're in Luke's parable, Luke's gospel, however, and I was just doing Beatitudes in Luke the other day, and Luke says, "Blessed are the poor," and then he turns around and says, "Woe to you who are rich." So there's some interesting values that Luke is playing out here, that those who are on the margins are those who are lifted up by
Hmm.
Jesus. The character of
Hmm.
God is with those on the margins in Luke's
Right.
gospel. And so here it wouldn't make a lot of sense, I don't think, for Luke to be lifting up this rich man as an image for God.
Right.
So I think we need to kind of ask ourselves maybe later, um, who is who's the rich man in our contemporary society here?
Right.
And I think it's an economic system more than it is a person. That economic
Yeah.
system that we're indebted to big corporations or something like that to get ahead, to
Yeah.
succeed, and
Yeah.
that's the purpose.
And we have, when we consider that in our society, that's interesting and I think good because also when we think about that in our society, there's a lot of players, and there's a lot of, there's big corporations, there's banks, there's government, there's
It's
all
complex.
kinds of players who are vying for control of and like this rich man and his manager have to work together. The manager needs the rich man's resources.
Yes.
The rich man needs the manager to manage the work. So they both depend on each other and they're both looking out for themselves. And and that also helps us, or that helps, me see, okay, well then I need to look at other people here because God is not about that. God is about, looking out for, you know, looking for those on the margin, as you were
Mhm.
saying, and
Mhm.
and caring for all and not about hoarding, um, you know, God's people together or hoarding what God has and
Yeah.
disregarding the rest.
Yeah. So I think maybe recognizing that about the character of God pulls us into this text in a different kind of way. One thing that's intriguing to me is the Greek word in the first verse. Yes, yeah. In the NRSV, it says charges were brought to the rich man that the manager was squandering his property. Charges were brought is an interesting phrase here because it it appears that the manager is guilty of something. I don't know what yet, but of squandering the property at least. Now, the Greek word here is probably the first thought is that it's actually the word slandered or falsely accused. So it could just as easily read, and maybe more appropriately read, the rich man who had a manager and people slandered him, falsely accused him of squandering the rich man's property. So that's an interesting thing going into this text too. I think a question going into it is, does it make a difference as we read the rest of this text whether the manager was squandering property and was guilty, or if he was simply accused of squandering property and was not guilty? Um, and then does that change how the story goes? I'm not
Yeah.
sure if it does or not,
Mhm.
but this is where I get into this text a little bit. I believe wealth is both a blessing and an opportunity. So throughout scripture, we have that phrase, you are blessed to be a blessing. And we've
Mhm.
said that many, many times. But I think um, I read that we're kind of held accountable less for what resources we've accumulated than how we use them in life. So I think from this point of view. The shrewdness of the manager for me comes through his recognition that he's amassed all this, or he's working in this economic system that's devaluing, and that it's all about success, and then it can go away just as quickly as it came. And he realizes that privilege of wealth has been, or success or work or whatever it is, has been developed at the expense of relationships.
Yeah.
So he's earned his money maybe by charging interest to the people.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then he finds himself between the rich man and the people, and he realizes, okay, I'm probably going to get fired. So how do I develop relationships? I've
Mm-hmm.
not developed relationships forever.
I don't have anybody to look out for me.
And so I'm going to shrewdly um, kind of subvert the whole system of charging. I'm going to cut. It's my job. I can cut wherever I want to. So I'm going to do that while I still can, so that others will respect that I have actually cared for them in their time of need. And maybe in my time of need, they'll care for me.
Well, yeah, and coming back to, that phrase that I talked about, the self preservation, his identity was in his wealth and his position, and his ability to get the money, and that was going to be lost, because um because he was going to lose his job, and he knew, oh, okay, well, then there goes my reputation. And so when it's
Right.
focused on, when his identity is focused on what he does and what he has, then he doesn't have that.
Yes.
So if I help you, then you will help me. And so it is all about saving face, and being able to continue to live in the manner to which he is accustomed. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably right. Now, if he's truly not a dishonest manager as we've given him, and he's been accused falsely, he's been probably still doing the bidding of the master, of the rich man.
Hmm.
And if he gets accused falsely of being whatever, maybe he moves into this recognition that, okay, I've been doing things the way they tell me to. I've
Hmm.
been sticking to this, and it's not working out for me. I'm still
Right,
being accused of things that
right,
I don't believe. So
right.
let me actually put to my belief some
Hmm.
actual action. I'm going to cut this stuff because they've been overcharged. I'm going to
Right.
do away with interest. I'm going to cut their bill in half because they can't afford it anyway, but
Hmm.
maybe they can't afford half. So
Right,
I'm going to pay attention to the person,
right.
and that's going to develop relationships that I haven't
Yes.
had before because I've only been doing it by the book. And now I'm going to just not
Yeah.
do that anymore because status, power, and privilege is fleeting. And
Yes.
we've all I I remember the 2008 financial thing. I know now we talk about inflation all the time. Um, and that's something that can affect us all.
Hmm.
But if we're trusting in God's attention and care, and we're developing relationships with other people that matter more, I think we can rest at ease
Yeah.
because our love is and our trust is not in economic systems where
Hmm.
money is the primary. Our
Hmm.
trust is in God and in the relationship with God's people who will
Right.
care for each other no matter what.
Absolutely. Yes. And so this brings up something interesting for me, is thinking about and making assumptions about motivations
Mm,
of a person, because I'm looking at this manager with the perception of, okay, well, he's just looking out for himself. well, which he is, but why?
Right.
Is it because he is greedy and trying to, maintain the status, or, so looking at that phrase in right there in the beginning about, so did he actually do this or was he accused of doing this? And so is he just like, wait, no, I was just doing what you told me to do and now you don't like it. And so, we have all um worked or functioned or heard of people who have worked and functioned in really dysfunctional systems, and so
Mhm.
was he in a system and then all of a sudden just had to, okay, well, let me see who else is out there and who I can build some trust with. So it's curious to read and explore and think about, and then take that into modern day as well, assumptions we make about people and why they do the things that they do. Um,
You mentioned to me, read on a little bit. You mentioned maybe wanting to bring this in. I think this is
I
a good place to bring in the next text.
I wanted to go, I was headed that way as well.
Yeah.
Um, so another thing that is helpful when I read a text that is a little bit perplexing or seems kind of, I don't quite understand what is this and why is Jesus telling this story. Um, well, and even if it makes sense, it's really helpful to read what comes before and what comes after to get a sense of um, what this story has to do. One of my rubs when I read this text, what preparing for today was, why in the world is Jesus reading this or share not reading, sharing this story? Well, then I went on to read in verses 14 and 15. Um, and so Jesus is saying to the disciples, but a lot of times when the disciples a- are there, others are around listening, and sometimes he's teaching about Jesus had a complicated relationship with Pharisees and religious rulers. So
Mhm.
verses 14 and 15. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your heart, for what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God."
Mhm.
And so this is a parable not for the disciples to know how to live, but this is addressing something about how the Pharisees choose to live and what they are doing. And so, money and reputation is a priority to them. And so Jesus like, I have a story to tell. So listen to this.
Yeah. And we could look at this in a couple of ways. When you add those verses and then read back into it, yeah, if the Pharisees are both the rich man and the shrewd manager
Mhm.
together, then it becomes this idea that the children of the light are those who are followers of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it says, um, make friends for yourself by dishonest wealth, so you have some place to go. And the master commands the dishonest manager at this point. So this idea of justifying themselves backward and forth and saying, God knows your hearts. God knows what matters most. Don't act dishonestly. Don't act unjustly,
Mhm.
because that's how the people who aren't children of the light do it. That's how they understand it. They know how to do that better than anybody. But the children of the light are the ones who live in humility and care for one
Mhm.
another, and recognize that we're placed on this earth to love and care for each other, not to separate ourselves with wealth, status, or privilege.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of where that might be. I love the phrase though, as you mentioned out, God knows your hearts. For what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. That's fascinating to me to think
Mhm.
about, what do we prize
Yeah.
that is at odds with God's way,
Yeah.
Jesus's way.
Yeah. I'm also fascinated and drawn into around verse 10 and 11.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we forgot
If you're
that.
faithful in little, you're faithful in much. If you're dishonest in little, you're dishonest in much. And so, thinking about who we are, and um I talk with kids, including my own, especially my own, about this a lot. Thinking and talking about who you are at home, at school, at church, and living authentically, and so it's and I liked um so yeah, just thinking about, who we truly are will just kind of permeate through all things, and will be evident if it's a one-on-one conversation that I'm having with
Mhm.
you, or if I am in, worship on Sunday in a room full of people, or out at the store with a bunch of strangers. I mean, there is an element of who I am, what I value, how I interact with and respond to the people who are with me. Because if I preach love and God's presence, and then drive down the street and throw trash out the window, or see someone who's homeless and say something terrible to them, well, then that's not those don't. But so I think, so again, this is bringing me back to identity, who we are and how we interact with, and it all comes back to when Jesus said this: what is the most important rule of them all? Love God and love your neighbor. And how we live that, and how we interact with that. And I think that's also true with our possessions, how we care for creation, how we hold on to, how we share what we have. All of that also says something about
Mhm.
what we believe about God
Mhm.
and our identity as a child of God.
And
Um,
and I think we can use money in lots of different ways. We can use it to get our
mhm,
own way by both giving it or withholding it.
mhm.
Um, and then it becomes a manipulative tool.
Yeah,
And that's something that scripture speaks against a lot. Or we can give generously and cheerfully
yeah.
and recognize that our goal is to um, care for other people, not to separate ourselves from them. I was reminded of St. Augustine's quote. He said that God gave us people to love and things to use, and sin manifests itself in our penchant. I can't say that word to confuse those two. We love things and use people. So if God gave us people to love and things to use, but we've kind of in our sinful state loved things and used people, we need to come back to what God is calling us to be,
Yes.
where we don't where things just are there to help deepen our relationships with God and with other people
Yes.
instead of holding it tight fisted. We release and trust. Instead of
Mhm,
scarcity mentality, we have an abundance.
mhm.
We're going to be doing a generosity campaign in the next month or so. We're in the process of a capital campaign now. And how can we give generously because we serve a generous God?
Yeah.
That's the question that we have throughout all of this. Our We tend to separate our finances from our faith
Mhm.
instead of making sure that our finances are a reflection of our faith. I knew someone, and I guess I could do this, but I don't know if I should. They were in a small group in which quarterly, maybe, I don't know how often it was. They were in an accountability group, and one of the things they did was open up their checkbooks to each other, their
Mm.
budgets to each other, because their concept was how we spend our money reflects our values.
Mm.
And so thinking about how they're using their money each day reflected those values. Are they are they deepening relationships with others through that money? Are they simply dividing or enjoying? Enjoying is not bad. I don't mean it in that way, because sometimes we enjoy life because of the resources we have. But when we don't balance that with how we care for one another, we can have a tendency to use people because we love our things too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it turns out you're right. This is a fascinating passage.
Yes.
There is a lot to explore here. Um,
I have a challenge.
okay,
Can I ask you a challenge? Because you're as we wrap
absolutely.
up,
Yes.
um, I'm gonna try to do this. I don't know. Hopefully, can do this. I want you to. I got this idea from a commentary I was reading
Okay, great.
to get a 3x5 card or something and
Okay.
write the name of one person, one relationship that you want to improve or deepen. Something and someone really that deserves your investment of time, energy, and money. Someone maybe that you don't have a deep relationship with now, write their name down and think about how you might invest time, energy, and money into loving that person into all God has created them to be. Because that's why our resources
Yeah.
are given to us by God, so that we can love and care for others along the way. So we
Can I
don't know how
ask you
long
a
we have.
question about that
Yes,
challenge?
you can.
Does it have to be an individual person or can it be a people group?
It can be a people group.
I'm
It can
I'm
be
just thinking
even.
about some people in here may want to think about maybe there's some call or pull to learn more about our prison ministry. And
Sure.
so maybe, want to think about how you can invest your resources of presence, financial resources, prayers in in reaching out
And
to
maybe that
so,
becomes an individual person too at some point, because I think sometimes
absolutely. It
we
is
put a
helpful
face with
when a
prisoners.
person has a name. And so
Yes.
you can write refugees, but really if you want to live into that, you'll talk with Casey about our refugee ministry and may get to know the name and give a ride to one of the refugees that we're supporting and working
Yeah.
with. And then all of a sudden it's not these people I know nothing about, but this person who has a name who I've had a conversation with and I'm building a relationship with. So I love that challenge.
And it's
It's
not just giving money to refugee ministry. It
yeah,
then becomes, oh wait, this is I'm giving money to care for
yes,
and develop
yes,
relationships with
yeah.
these people.
It's fascinating because I often talk about, and I do think this matters, and I think that Jesus does this, drawing the circle wider, 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 moving out. But I think also sometimes we need to move in.
Hmm.
And so it is a personal relationship with
Yes.
a person that we can name, not just like, well, I can't be bothered to really care for so and so because I'm caring for all these people and being able to be a little bit more anonymous and removed. So while we're widening the circle of God's love in our community, we also do that by moving into relationship with individual
And
people.
that's a both and.
Yes,
Because we
100%. So I love that
because
challenge
we
and what
have
that calls us
yeah,
to.
because we have some examples of that. We want youth, young adults to be a part of our congregation, and
Mhm.
yet we don't know them.
Yep.
And developing relationships is what brings people together as the family of God,
Yeah.
as the body of Christ.
Yes.
And that's how we grow in our love for one another out
Yeah.
of our differences and uniqueness. But we can't have this abstraction over here. Young people think this, want this, whatever.
Mhm.
Let's find out let's meet one,
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
conversation with them,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
just what we read on the internet.
Absolutely.
No.
And if we can help you with that, if you have something in mind or and need help making a connection or opening a door, please reach out to Tommy and I, and we would be glad to help 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 connect you with a person or ministry, or think about how you might be able to develop and open up some new relationships. So it has been a great time of conversation and challenge. Look forward to being together in worship and reflecting further on this passage. Um, and then we'll be back together again next week. Go in peace.
Go in peace. Amen.